On today's episode of Parasport Nation, Nathan and I go head to head with some of the hot button questions and issues in parasport, like, are there too many medals awarded at the Paralympics? All that and more to come on today's episode. Let's start PSN.
Welcome to Parasport Nation with Alex Smyth and Nathan Clement.
Hello and welcome into Parasport Nation. I'm Alex Smyth, and as always, I am joined by my co-host Nathan Clement. Nathan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Alex. I survived the bomb cyclone out of Vancouver, so I'm excited to talk some sport now.
Yeah, well, now we're going into a different type of cyclone, a sports cyclone, hot button questions, hot button issues getting thrown left, right, and center. So this is going to be a bit different of a show. We're going back and forth. We got a timer on the clock. It's going to be timing down our responses to the question. We'll see how many we can get through. Are you ready, Nathan?
I can't wait. Let's go, Alex.
Okay, so the first question, you're going to be up first. How far is too far when it comes to classification doping?
I think in the baseline, any sort of classification doping is too far in the first place, but in many instances, there's forging of medical documents that have gone on in the past, or lying about someone's disability, or even performing and making your condition look worse than it is, and even aspects of bringing in assisted guides or bringing in different aspects that people need in their mobility for everyday life that athlete or that person doesn't need to a classification. So it's always walking that fine line of pretty well like any sort of classification doping is over the line, but there are moments, there are incidents where people go way beyond, like certain teams even won Paralympic medals and had them stripped away as they've found out they've been doping and they've been doing all these different things. But let me throw it back to you. What is too far across that classification line?
Yeah, so I think obviously, and to explain for folks who don't know, classification doping, the idea of just making your disability appear in one way, shape, or form more severe, more limiting than it actually might be. The instances that come to mind for me and stories I've heard is where you literally have, especially when it comes to vision loss, and you'll have athletes who are competing who have vision loss who qualify, but then they still have a driver's license. And that happens a couple times. I've heard that from a few different places. Like, there should be these baselines that, like, if you are claiming you have a disability, you can't have these other things going on. If you say you have vision loss, you can't be driving. You know, like, if you want to level the playing field, I think stuff like that's too far. Obviously, when it's nefarious, when it's cheating like that, when you're altering medical documents, there has to be, that is definitely a red line you can't cross. That said, you have to have flexibility within that. I think every single person's disability experience is all going to be slightly different. So there needs to be that wiggle room. But yes, when it comes to certain milestone markers, like, the certain documentation being changed, or the fact that you are able to drive yourself if you have vision loss or something along those lines, that's where that red line is. That's where it needs to stop. Otherwise, it becomes too much of an unfair advantage.
Exactly. And just to add on to what you're saying there too, is like, even for myself with my disability and my condition, I'm someone who progresses with effort, with exertion. So how I look at my everyday versus when I'm in a competitive or race setting varies. So with classification, the whole point of classification is to see the athlete, not when they're at their best, but not when they're at their worst, but in the heat of competition, when there's the heat of movement and motion. And it's very difficult, and it can be very challenging because everyone has a wide range of ability and everyone has a wide kind of skill set. And some athletes need adaptations and some athletes need those little things to help them get through. So I'm going to throw this question to you, Alex. Where is the limit for personal adaptations?
So I have two thoughts on this, and I think back to the Paris Paralympics leading up to it, and during the games, we had a chance to interview Austin Smyth, whose story as a wheelchair racer all involved around him using his engineering background to actually modify his racing chair to really give them that competitive edge. So the idea of shaving off a couple, ounces or grams of weight here and there, that any little bit helps, and making it more aerodynamic. I am in favor of one of two options. You can either allow for maximum creativity. So as long as a device or the equipment falls under general parameters, like it has to be between this weight and this weight, this size and this size, this length and this length, I think that would be key. Otherwise, I think you have to do it that everyone is on the same plane using the same equipment. So you show up to the competition, you are all getting the exact same racing chair for your classification. If you have a lower limb loss, you are all using that same chair. That's how I view it. What about you?
Like you, I feel like customization in parasports is so important because everyone has varying disabilities and various different conditions. And it's quite a tricky line where there's some sports that you need that customization, but also you need sports like sitting volleyball, for example, where you can't be giving athletes like an unfair advantage versus other countries and other competitors. Where in cycling, that's my background, that's my sport now. I have a varying different bike than people who have similar conditions from me. I need to have my handlebar a little lower on my left side just for a safety aspect and just for safety because I have uncontrolled spasticity in my arm. So there's varying different kind of things that allow for that kind of customization that is needed, but there's also that other aspect to it too. And I would love your opinion on this as well, is obviously different NSOs, national sport organizations, have different funding levels than other countries. So if you're a country like Canada versus somewhere else in the developing world, we're going to have an advantage over other countries when it comes to getting the best equipment possible, and trying to find ways to similarly equal the playing field is very, very important, because I know other countries that are spending millions and millions of dollars on tech, on other information, where other budgets just can barely afford a bike. So it's a varying different situation there. And I feel like adaptation is important for the athlete because one, it allows for safety, two, it allows for comfort, and three, it allows for high performance, allows for aerodynamics. Like I even talked, as you mentioned, Austin Smeek, I talked to him in the village a whole bunch about tire pressure, about the aerodynamics and building of the bike. And that's something that we talk about all the time in my sport, but I know other sports look at that too. But there's also that just cost disparity between like all the other countries. So trying to figure out ways that everyone has the same access to personal adaptations.
Yeah, I think you're going to run into that regardless of sport, whether it's a pair sport or otherwise. There's just going to be certain nations, even if they have the funding models, they're not necessarily going to invest it the same ways. We know with the U.S., they are very heavily involved with funding their para programs. Same thing, you look at some of the other top performers. China, always investing a ton of money into their para athletes and this high performance level of competition. Hence why they come away with all the medals. Canada is very inconsistent when it comes to the funding. Some sports get much more secured fundings. Other ones really have to fight for it, or it's less kind of consistent. So that is just a natural, I think, result when it comes to funding in sport in general. I think there has to be a middle ground, though, between the idea of customization for, comfort and style to, no, we actually need to make it that, hey, this is a competition. Like, you have to work with what you have and go forward accordingly. But let's move on to another question here, Nathan, I got for you. Should there be a sport that has no classification? That means any person with a disability can go in and compete as long as they identify or classify as having a disability broadly. It's not broken down into different subsects. Should there be a sport like that?
I don't believe so. No, I believe there is that importance of having that kind of classification breakdown. Now, and I'm going to throw this to you. There are certain para sports that maybe not at the Paralympic level, but internationally and in the national development level needs to have able-bodied athletes in there too. and you need to get rid of that kind of barrier and add in a different class, add in a different category. Like Patrick Anderson brought it up, talking about wheelchair basketball is the perfect example of that. You can have an A, B, or non-functioned or non-affected category or class. And I even think like para ice hockey would be a perfect example. And there's some certain sports that can definitely do that. Even with seven-a-side soccer for a while had a brain injury category where the athletes had full function of their two upper limbs and two lower limbs. So there's different aspects and different categories that can definitely play in there. But I'd love to throw that back to you. What do you think of adding classes to certain sports that would be for non-affected athletes?
I think there's definitely merit to it. I think absolutely Patrick Anderson brought it up when we spoke to him about, it should be more open-ended in the sport of wheelchair basketball. I think a lot of wheelchair sports could have that same kind of idea of having that kind of category to it, because there is still a less of a classification system, but it's more of that grading numeric system. Wheelchair basketball has it. Wheelchair rugby has it, where, if someone is fully able-bodied, they're still playing in a sport wheelchair, and you just have the highest grade possible. There's still that strategic element into it. How you build up that point system of your team on the court at any one time. I'd like to see more flexibility in that. Another one I would say could be more open to having wider ranges of disability, goalball. You automatically put people on the same playing field by having them all wear eye shades. If someone is playing and they have perfect vision, they're still having their eyesight covered up. Let's say they have a limb loss of some kind. That is a disadvantage to them, but that shouldn't stop them from being able to play the game. And so I think that's what I would like to see. It's more that opportunity to try these different sports, even if you may yourself, because of the nature of your disability, be at a bit of a disadvantage, but still having that opportunity to try. So that's where I land on it, Nathan. But for you, let's move on to next one. Are there too many medals at the Paralympics? We see certain sports really flood kind of the medal totals because of all these different classifications, different kind of types of events. Are there too many medals at the Paralympics?
I'm going the complete opposite direction. As someone who's a cyclist and has had teammates and myself in the factoring system, I think there's not that many medals. There needs to be more. There needs to do more to have a more concerted effort to have every category be able to be on their own, have their own discipline. Like the perfect example that comes to mind outside of cycling too is para-alpine, and how all the classes, whether you're standing, VI, or you're in the sitting class, you're all factored together. And it's very difficult for so many different athletes who might be less affected, having to go up against someone who may have a little bit of a factoring buffer there. And it really, I think, hurts the Paralympic movement and hurts the image that we have so many classes and so many categories factored and combined together at major sporting events. And I hope, since they've just been announced to be going to LA in 2028, I hope paraclimbing is able to have that vast diversity of classes and not being broken in and broken down like what we experience with cycling, what para-alpine experiences, and what even sometimes para-athletics goes through. We have a sport like para-swimming, which I've come from a swimming background, so you have butterfly, backstroke, breaststroke, freestyle, all unique strokes, and every category and every class has just themselves going head to head against their own category, where you have an S6 going up against an S6. You don't have S6s and S7s and S5s. However, I will say with swimming, if your category has less than about 5 swimmers, I believe, at the international level, which more happens in the lower affected classes, they will combine at that point, and that makes sense. But for a sport like paracycling, we have over 5, we have over 7, we have 10 athletes pretty well in every single category and every single classification. We have that depth now. So why don't we just separate? That is the big and kind of thing I see, is there's too few of medals. But I would love to hear what you think.
I am going the opposite direction. Now, I will agree that there's certain sports that I feel do not get enough medal consideration due to the nature of the competitions and how medals are handed out. I think it's ridiculous that you get sports like wheelchair rugby, wheelchair basketball, para ice hockey. The teams get one medal and one medal only. But swimming, you have a chance, depending on how good of a swimmer you are, you can rake in dozens of medals throughout your competition life span. The fact that you mentioned, yes, you have all the. So let's say you take one person, one athlete from one disability category, and they can then also compete in all the different types of races, but not just the different strokes, but then you get the different distances. I think there's just too many in that regard. I would like to see it kind of shrunk down in some sense, like whether it's okay, instead of having a 25, 50, 100, 200, 400, well, maybe you have half those races. And then that way you may not get rid of the medals themselves, but find other ways to have those medals allocated to other athletes in other competitions in other sports. Because whenever you see, oh, the most winningest or the most amount of medals for any Paralympic athlete or any athlete, 9 times out of 10, they're coming from the swimming side of things, or in like the Olympic side, it's either swimming or it's skating. And those are the two sports that are most notorious for having so many events, so many ways to win medals. I'd like to see that change. So
Yeah.
that's where I land on things when it comes to that. But
Yeah. But with that,
for
and,
yourself, Nathan,
sorry, I'm going to
go
throw
ahead.
it back to you right now.
Yep.
Is that an individual sport versus team sport issue versus the games having too many medals? Because you can look at it in this way, being like, if you could have multiple different tournaments going on at a game, say for like wheelchair basketball, but that's unfortunately not the case there, where you have that round robin group, and when you have 8, 10, 12 teams, and you're supposed to get through this event in 10 days. So it's very quick. You go through round robin, you're playing back to backs, even triple headers. And then before you know it, you're in the knockout round. And before you know it, you're hopefully in the medal round. And by that time in swimming, or I'm going to use swimming as my example here, is you have so many different unique strokes. Backstroke is way different than butterfly, and butterfly is way different than breaststroke. And even with those classifications breakdowns, is say for example an S6, like what I was, or SB6 as a swimming breaststroker 6, I could only do 100 breaststroke. That was the only event you could do. And actually, like for butterfly, I could only do 50 meters butterfly. For freestyle, that's where you have more variety, but it was 50, 100, 400. And they're so unique, they're so different in their strokes and in their disciplines that you need to have that differential. And you could argue, yeah, you could maybe condense some of those events down, but that's that core foundation, and that's kind of like that historic legacy of the sport too. And whenever you get into like legacy and that sort of thing, it gets challenging, it gets difficult. But I do
Yeah, it
understand.
does.
Yeah,
It does, but there's also the aspect, as you said for yourself. It's like cycling is so limited. Like I would view you could handle cycling and swimming very similarly. You're both in sports where unless you're doing like a medley or team relay or something like that, you are individual racing sports. Yes, I think there should be a balance. Bring a couple more distances over to the cycling side. I'm not. I don't mean to be targeting both of your sports, your Paralympic sports, but I think it's just very apt because, like in cycling, you could argue, well, you could have a 5 kilometer. You could have a 10 kilometer. You could have a 25 kilometer. You could have a 50 kilometer race, all in the same competition. Like if you really wanted to, that's where I feel swimming is at right now, and that's just a broader kind of issue I have. So it's not necessarily that it's a team sport versus an individual. It just swimming has always had this so many different distances, so many different disciplines. I understand the strokes are different. I think then be more selective on the number of distances that you can change, because I don't think there is a difference, but I don't think there's enough that, oh, that's worthy of, you have to hand out another medal for another 50 meters or something like that. So that's where I'm coming from on that. We agree to disagree on that topic, Nathan, but here's one I really am interested to find out. What is the most difficult or challenging Paralympic sport?
I obviously have a very biased answer, so I'm gonna throw that one out there either way. I'm gonna give you two, but I'm gonna give you the biased one
Okay.
first is paracycling. And the reason why, I just think the amount of exertion, the amount of effort that goes into a race, like any sport really, it is extremely difficult. But when you're cycling, especially for someone like me, I'm averaging 190 to 200 beats per minute the whole time I'm racing. So I'm on that cusp of max exertion. And for a lot of us, you're expected to make quick decisions, quick reads, adapt, adjust at speeds of 30 plus kilometers an hour while you're at that kind of high heart rate. And I know teammates and I know other people who, like myself, our conditions get affected when we're tired, when we're exhausted, when we're in the cold, when we're in the heat. And we're always battling the elements, whether it's headwinds, crosswinds, tailwind, crazy rain. I've even had races, not internationally, but domestically in snow. And you just have to find ways to get around there. And you're always adapting. You're always trying to stay mellow, stay calm, and adjust. So I think cycling, in my biased opinion, is one of the toughest. But I'm also going to throw another sport out there too. I really think wheelchair basketball is extremely difficult. And same as, like, I could even throw wheelchair rugby in there too. Just the team dynamic, the strategy, the gamesmanship. And as we talked about with classification, there's strategy to your classifications there. How you set your field up well, how do you set your players up well, and how do you kind of adjust and make moves throughout the matches. And this is more of an outside eyes looking into the sport. But that's complicated. That's difficult when that strategy is so needed and that tactics is so needed, and just the force, the brutality of these sports just take a toll on the athlete, take a toll on the player, especially as you develop, as it's quick sprints, quick motions again and again and again. And almost that interval can be even more challenging, just setting a pace and just sitting at a certain pace for a certain period of time, because your body's always readjusting and readapting to everything going on. How about you?
So I was on along the same lines as your cycling. I'm going to para triathlon. I agree with everything you said about the cycling. Then also throw in swimming and running into the mix as well on the same race. That has to be the most challenging. It's not only the endurance side of things, it's three different disciplines, three different types of exertion rolled into one. I think hands down, para triathlon is the most challenging, most difficult sport. I like what you said about wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby. I just think when you stack it up against para triathlon, nothing can beat it, just on all those different factors. Last question, Nathan. We got to be quick on this one. What is one sport you'd love to see at the Paralympics, winter or summer?
I'm going to say summer first. I think parasurfing needs to get into a games real soon. Um, just the skill level, the talent level, and just what it can create is super special. On the winter slide, I really think para blind hockey needs to be a Paralympic sport. But I'm also going to throw another one in there too, because I know I've always heard rumblings about it. It's para bobsled. Para bobsled and para ice hockey needs to be in the winter games.
Why do you got to steal my thunder like that? I was going with para bobsled, Nathan. Come on now. You're stealing my thunder. Not only that, I will go a step further. Para bobsled needs to be in the Paralympics, but it also needs to be a multi-disability, multi-classification sport. There can be up to 4 racers on a bobsled. Have them each be a different type of disability. Really combine disability classes into a single sport. So if maybe someone is a wheelchair user, have them start in the sled. Maybe someone has a visual impairment. Maybe they're in the back or something like that. Have someone with limb loss or limited motion. I'd like to get creative with that. Have a bit more innovation when it comes to parasport and the Paralympics. Really make it something unique that you're not going to find anywhere else. But on that note, we got to wrap up our rapid fire back and forth head to head question. This has been phenomenal, Nathan. We're definitely going to be doing this again because I have a bunch more questions I want to pepper you with. I want to fight with you on certain answers and responses more. But for now, let's wrap things up with the Parasport update.
Now, the PSN update.
Fresh tracks, both present and future, are being laid in the Rocky Mountain snow as Canada's largest Paranordic development camp wrapped up. 22 athletes and 10 coaches gathered in Canmore, Alberta for a week of intensive training. From the training ground to the race course, Canada's emerging talent and current roster showcased their skills on the first day of the Canmore Continental Cup. In the 5-kilometer classic event, Colin Cameron, Mark Arenz, Natalie Wilkie, and Maddie Mullen claimed victory in their respective classes. With more races ahead, it's shaping up to be an exciting week in Alberta. Meanwhile, the action shifts from the Rockies to the pool as Canada prepares to make a splash for the first time since Paris. The 2024 City Paraswimming World Series brings the world's best swimmers to Mexico, offering valuable opportunities for competition and classification. Check back next week to see how Canada performed on the snow and in the water. And that's the Parasport preview.
Nathan, you're trying to get me all riled up once again when the talk of swimming. I still am amped up in talking about it, but it. No, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to potentially have a potential guest mad at me and not wanting to come on the show because I'm venting my opinions. But needless to say, it's an exciting time in the world of parasport. We didn't even talk about like para-biathlon or para-cross country. That's another great sport. I think that's underrated, especially when you have to balance the shooting and the cross-country aspects of it. Is certainly one to keep an eye on as the season progresses. But Nathan, as always, thank you so much for joining me and kind of pushing me back and forth with the different questions.
Thank you, Alex. It's a pleasure to chat today and pleasure to go head to head. And I think we have future conversations about medals coming up, hopefully soon in the future.
Absolutely. That is Nathan Clement. I'm Alex Smyth. Thank you so much. Catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to Parasport Nation. Like and subscribe to the channel to follow us now.